welcome to the Genre Fiction Podcast. I am Jack Roney. I'm here with my partners in crime, Harry Colfer and Bryn Smith.
G'day.
G'day.
Ahoy, hoy.
That was not a bad Aussie accent.
I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
So we're coming.
You've assimilated well.
Yeah, it's bloody cold at the moment, as you can see.
Yeah, so we're coming from Harry's house here here in Brisbane, where it's a little bit chilly, and we even have our fireplace crackling in the background. So we've got some nice ambience for our episodes today. All right, what I wanted to talk about today was discussing writing standalone novels versus a series, the pros and cons of that. Maybe we could just discuss our own journeys and how, if that's going to help other writers in terms of formulating ideas, whether they should just focus on a standalone, or is there scope for their first novel to evolve into something in more detail.
I think we can also discuss about short stories and whether those can lead on to different things as well, and whether the short stories can be a series. So not just novels.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I was actually talking to someone yesterday about, you look at a lot of Stephen King's novellas. They've even, his novella called The Body was converted into a movie, Stand By Me. So a lot of great ideas can be really fleshed out from a short story or a novella, and you can certainly extend that into a series. So who'd like to start discussing?
Why are you both looking at me? Yeah,
it's like, oh my God, do I have to start?
Yeah.
Maybe talk us through with your books, Brendan, in terms of where you started when you first wrote book one. Were you already thinking about this is book one of a series?
Well, it's interesting that you raised the idea of the short story, because Magnus Knights came from a short story that I won in university, and the short story ended up having enough meat in it, and the world that I had dipped my toe in seemed to be big enough that it would work as a novel. So the core idea was big enough that it could be expanded upon into a full 80,000 word text. So it definitely occurred in the sense of, like, did start off small. All things start small. You just get your idea, and then that turned into a short story, and then that turned into a novel. And yes, now the novel has or will become a series. Currently working on book 2, and there's about 5 book series overall. Like, I know everything needs to be in trilogies these days, but 3's just too short for the full story to be told. Especially 3 80,000 word books. It's just not. It's not enough.
But your book 2 for Magnus Knights is completed, isn't it? Or are you still working on that?
No, I'm still doing the editing. I'm doing this new form of editing, which I haven't tried before, which is, because I've got multiple point of view characters, I'm trying to make sure that every chapter where you go into a new character's head, they actually feel like a unique person. And then when you return to that character later in the piece, it's consistent. So that all of the Detective Craddock chapters feel like you're actually in Detective Craddock's head. All of the Beaumont chapters feel like you're in Beaumont's head. All of the Bishop chapters feel like you're in Bishop's head. And it's a really challenging experience to write the narrative, because it's easy enough to write unique dialogue, right? But it's very difficult to write unique narrative of just simply describing things in the environment that would match that character's mood, opinions, and in some cases biases and prejudices and things like that.
Yeah, so conveying their inner thoughts and the tone and their voice. And we're talking about the voice isn't just dialogue, it's
the inner voice. Yes, conveying the inner dialogue.
And just as, being the whole sort of pantser plotter thing, do you plot that beforehand? Or for me, what I'll do is I'll write in the point of view of whichever character, and then afterwards read it and go, yeah, that they wouldn't say that, or they wouldn't, and then tweak it afterwards. After the fact, as a plotter, do you have to say, okay, how am I going to describe this before you actually write it?
No, I haven't been able to figure out a way. Well, I haven't tried to plot it. I don't think you really could plot it. The only sort of preparatory work I've done for this is I've got a bunch of books on my shelf, and I go, that book is written in the inner voice of this character, and that book is written in the inner voice of this character. So I'll just grab that book off the shelf, flick through it until I find a couple of paragraphs that really grab me, read through that, and I'll go, okay, this is how this person talks, and then I'll go through the chapter and I'll apply that sort of filter and remove things that don't match with what that character's inner voice would sound like to me, and throw stuff in that would. That's the only way I've been able to figure out how to do it.
Right.
So
literally imitating someone's voice that I think is close enough to the real thing for me. Yeah.
So if we carry that theme through in terms of keeping your character voices consistent, but then moving that into, you know, the topic of carrying that over to a book 2 and a book 3 and keeping that consistency all the way through. A question for both of you, I'll ask you first, Brent. How does so you've said that you're editing book 2, you've already started to think ahead that this is a 5-book series. How does it play into your plot and planning how each book is going to end, as far as how much are you going to resolve the story issues or how much are you going to carry over as cliffhangers for book 3?
Yeah. It's the eternal balancing act, isn't it? Because you can't have one book be what do you call it? You can't just have one book where you're killing time and just hovering over the main story, waiting for something more important to happen in the next book to kick things off.
No one likes Back to the Future 2. It's
I didn't mind it. It's the only good trilogy out there. Like not even the original Star Wars trilogy was as good as the Back to the Future trilogy.
But it just stops, and you know that they're wanting you to then watch the next one. And I feel that even though a series, for me, I much prefer each book in its own right to have a completed story and it finishes.
Yeah, it's got to be satisfying.
Because otherwise you end up feeling a little bit cheated if you've spent all of this time. I mean, it takes a while. For me, it certainly takes a while to read an 80,000 word plus book and then to actually not have a completed story at the end of it and the requirement to go and read the next one. That I find quite frustrating. So for me, a series, although each one could be read in its entirety from the without actually reading the rest of the series. But obviously you get more from it by knowing that character and how they're developed over time. And so it's obviously more logical to read the series in order. However, you could just pick one of those books up and start reading it.
Yeah.
That for me is an essential part of a series, I think, for me. I don't like this sort of idea that, you've got to read every single one of that series to actually understand what the hell's going on.
Right.
I guess if you looked at Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, that book was essentially divided up into 3 parts for 3 movies. But I think even in the book, there's a end of scene or.
Well, I think that actually was one book. It had 3 parts to it.
Yeah, 3 parts. Yeah, so it was one
so
book, but
it was actually originally one book.
Yeah, but it still had distinct parts. Yeah, I've actually.
It wasn't just printed as an omnibus where it's 3 books in one physical book.
I think originally it was written as one book.
Yeah, it's
really.
Yeah,
I've got 3 parts.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, no way.
I'm open to anybody wanting to correct that. But
I've got it at home. I've read it a couple of times. I've read it twice, the whole thing from cover to cover. It's 3 parts, but it's written as one book.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, no way.
But the 3 parts are not concluding storylines for the people that know clearly you've got to get right to the very end to know the outcome of the story. It's one continuous story threaded across all 3. But I take your point, Harry. I also agree. I subscribe to the notion that even if you are writing a series, it is good, even from a marketing point of view, if readers become interested in one of your books, they love a particular cover or they just happen to come across one of your books, you can still say to them, look, because people will ask you, do I have to read it in order? And you can say, well, look, you don't have to. You can pick this up and it's a standalone book. It's its own story with its own conclusion. You might get some benefit if you start from book 1, if you to get to know the characters. But so how do you do that? How do you and again, it's a question for both of you, knowing that each of your books has a start and a finish and it's a story in its own right, even though some of the character themes will continue into book 2. How do you do that so that when you come to book 2, you can still insert a bit of important information at the beginning for someone who might have picked up book 2 to start with, so you can quickly get them up to speed about what was the setting or what's the backstory in book 1?
I think I with the my second book in the Jono series, I just added a few scenes where what happened in book 1 were explained in passing. And that just allowed the links. So somebody who's read from book 1 will be able to just sort of, and they understand what things are on them. But people who are reading it from the second book can be that sort of aspect of him wanting to catch a serial killer. That sort of just given a nod to it and an explanation of where his mindset is. So it is it's not too difficult to do that in the fact that you can just add in a little scene to be explained. You don't have to have a big wodge of text saying this is what happened in book one, and then
no flashbacks.
Flashbacks are really really bad. So you can do it subtly, I think, to just explain what's going on to the reader who's picked up your book too.
Well, here's the thing though, if you've got a strong enough self-contained story, you don't need to refer back to the previous book a whole lot. You know, that self-contained story, even if it depends on events that occurred in the past, you can refer to them, as Harry was saying, but you don't need to dwell on them, might be the best way of looking at it, because if it's fully self-contained, then the reader will enjoy that book on its face value, and if they go back and then read book one and then reread book two, then they get the extra layer, I guess, that would only be available to someone who's reading the series in its entirety.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, how did I do this? Because when I wrote my first book,
Jack, how did you do this?
Yeah, thank you. No, I thought I'd
Dodging the question here, mate.
Yeah.
Go on.
I like being the one asking the questions.
Nothing like the detective in you, mate.
I was going to say, yes.
At least we haven't got a big light shining on us. Although we've got a camera.
So when I wrote book one, I had no inclination that I didn't even know why I was writing it, and I'd had no inclination that it was going to be book one of a series until right at the very end. And I thought, I concluded there was this, climactic scene in the cemetery where the bad guy's holding a gun to a hostage, and it plays out, and then that's the end of the story. Then I started thinking, well, I love my character, Detective Jared O'Connor, so much. I feel that he's got more stories to tell. So I started to devise a way in which I could carry it over into a book two with a brand new story with the same characters, but still to have a linkage between them. So I that's where I use my prologue to plant a seed to when readers have finished book one, so not prologue, the epilogue, they then flick across to the epilogue, and there's this kind of poignant scene where he's standing over a quarried lake, and certain things happen that kind of plant the idea that there's another killer out there, and that this other killer will emerge in book two in a brand new storyline. But what I devise is that there's a link between the killer for book two, and he's linked to the killer from book one, who meets his demise in book one. A bit of a spoiler, but so I've been able to maintain a bit of a linkage, and then that carries through to book three as to what's the link between these killers. But I didn't pre-plan that. That was something that was just an afterthought. But how I bridged the gap was by using the epilogue.
Yeah. Okay. I did something similar with Magnus Knights, because there was this subplot that hadn't been wrapped up, and If you're listening to this and you have a book where you think you've wrapped everything up, but then there's this one random thread that's not resolved, that could be the impetus for your book two.
Yeah.
Yes.
Especially if it's closely linked to the events of book one. Like, there's no need for you to wrap everything up.
So there could be a resolution to this particular quest or journey or something that's happening, but the underlying thread of bigger issues are still yet unresolved, and that they can continue through onto your subsequent books.
Exactly. And you can do it with the epilogue and make it very clear as well that these unresolved issues will now be the driving force behind the plot for book two.
Yeah. And as far as we talked about, as you said, Bryn, not having a big flashback exposition scene where we, getting the readers up to date, if you haven't read book one, let's give you a quick update as to what, so you're up to speed and you can, immerse yourself in book two. The way I did it was I just simply had a scene, because there was a traumatic scene relating to Jared O'Connor's young daughter. And in book two, in the very early stages, I made reference to, he was kind of lamenting about how she was still dealing with some trauma. And it was just, he was having kind of just a quick flash about a gun pressed to her head. It was one or two sentences only, just to allude to the fact that something traumatic happened in book one. The readers don't really need to know about it to enjoy book two, but you just need to know that something happened and that his daughter's still dealing with some trauma, and then push on with story two.
That's it. Like, not flashbacks, but memory flashes, maybe.
Yes.
Trauma flashes, I guess, would be the best way of putting
it.
Just
little snippets.
I've read plenty of books where I had no idea they were a part of a series, and sort of got to the end, and only afterwards, when I thought, I wonder if there's more of this character, then you discover you're at book 5 or something like that in this series. Oh crap!
It didn't have anything in like
sometimes
in the before or after text which said these characters will return, or the latest so and so adventure. None of that.
No, it depends on the marketing. So I think I'm talking about years ago, where perhaps that sort of thing of making sure you have book number 1 or book 4, and that's sort of some sort of written thing saying that this is a series. That's, I think, more recent. Something that will happen as a marketing thing to make sure that people are reading more of that author. And well, it depends on how you get hold of the book, and if you've just picked up a secondhand book or something like that, perhaps there isn't something on the front which says book 3.
I've got one for you. So have either of you read the Bernard Cornwell Sharp series, or even watched the TV series which had Sean Bean as Sharp?
I know of it, yeah.
Yeah. You would not know that it was part of a series unless you read to the end of the historical note at the end of the book, where Cornwell talks about, these are the historical inaccuracies, these are what really happened, these are the references I consulted, and at the end of every historical note is the sentence, Sharp and Harper will march again. So you don't know it's a series until you read to the end of, like, the appendix.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, isn't there that TV series, is it called, I haven't watched it yet, my kids keep telling me I've got to watch it, Black Mirror, and every episode is, you can watch it in any order, every episode is a different story, but I think there's some loose linkages, but you can just watch whatever episode in whatever particular order.
It's an anthology, isn't it?
Well, I know an author who's written 32 short stories that you can read in any order. But
I smell a plug.
we need a sound effect for that. Another thing I was going to mention, James Patterson, and talking about how do you even incorporate the series number in your title of your book. So James Patterson's Alex Cross series, I think it's up to 23, or it could even be more now. It started with First to Die, second something, third. I remember there was the Fifth Horseman. Every title had the number, the 6th, 7th, 8th, all the way out to the 19s, 18s. So he incorporated the number of the book into the actual title, which I thought was really clever.
That could get difficult.
That is a smart way of doing it, though. Yeah, but God, when you're getting up to double digits, that's when things start to get tricky, right?
And he's got
Matt Riley did the same thing with like 5 ancient wonders or 6 sacred stones and something like that series.
Yeah. And Alex James Patterson also did it with his Women's Murder Club series as well. I think he incorporates the number of the book into the title.
Oh, okay.
I think we started touching on
movies tend to do that as well, but
Look at you, Star Wars.
Back to the Future 2, Back to the Future 3. So that was pretty clever, mate.
Yeah.
In terms of marketing, the general question around the difference between I've got a standalone novel, and plus I've got my series. I know there's different sort of stats around benefit, pros and cons in terms of book sales and gaining readers and fans who are likely to continue reading your books if you put out a series of standalones versus a connected series. Do you guys have any thoughts on that in terms of pros or cons from a marketing point of view?
There is some advice that does say a series is better for building an audience early on, because what happens is you can use your first book as the series, as series intro, as it logically should. By what you do is you have your first book be on Amazon for like 99 cents in the month or two in the lead up to the release of book 2, and then book 2 drops, and you've had this 2 month sale of your first book being there on the cheap, and that means that people who go to get that book on the cheap are then perfectly primed to read book 2 because you've just launched book 2 with the following that sale. Yeah. So I have heard advice along that, and it makes a lot of sense to do that, and that way you have, number one, you build your audience, and number 2, you're also using the the ebook sales algorithm to your advantage.
Yeah, and I've heard the same thing on particularly Amazon and ebooks, that the way the algorithms work and the benefits, that the old notion of the best way to sell books is to publish more books, and that probably lends itself more to a series.
I think the thing is that as a writer, you put a lot of effort into creating the characters, and so at some point you feel, well, they're sort of part of your family sort of thing, and you want to actually write more with them as sort of tell more of their story. So unless you kill them off in the end of the story, the chances are that there's more to tell. And one story, as you mentioned, 80,000 words may be too short to actually tell a full story about that particular person. Especially, that's why, obviously, in crime you often work with or have the main character being the detective, because that's their job, is to solve mysteries, to solve crimes that have happened, and so they have an explanation as to why this keeps happening to them, and there's a new story for them to talk about. And so they're the easy ones to have series with, because you don't want to get into the whole sort of Die Hard, how can all of this happen to the same person?
Yes, yeah.
Or Midsummer Murders, where like
where
it's a town of 200 and they have a murder every other week. It's like, how's the population of the town still not drop below 200?
And I think I've mentioned it in the podcast, as that with my series, it was because the main character is a paramedic. How does all of this shit happen to the same person? And that was probably one slight aspect of plotting that I got involved with, is the fact that as I started writing the first book, I then was thinking, well, how can I make this character into into a series? And I spent some time having to think about, well, what can I do and how can that happen? And so I don't want to say too much about the spoilers and things like that, but to have some bad guy who may be a continuing presence can sort of tie things together. But also you meet a particularly bad person in one book, and then if you don't kill them off, then you've got a chance to move into the next one. It gives that explanation as to why this is continuing on for this poor person who all these sort of bad things happen to them. That does require a little bit of forethought. But for me, that's literally a case of I came up with 5 ideas for stories and how they link to each other.
So can I ask for both of you, at what stage did you decide, okay, I'm going to write a book too? So, Bryn, you said Magnus Knight started as a short story and you felt there was enough volume to convert it into a full-length manuscript. At what point of your writing journey of your first book did you say, okay, I know there's enough there to carry this through to a book 2 and beyond?
It would have been in the planning stage when I was mapping out the scenes, because it eventuated very quickly that for all the antagonists of book 1 to be apprehended, neutralized, killed, imprisoned would take a lot more work on behalf of the main characters and a lot more, I guess, lucky circumstances in the world. And that's not the world that these characters live in. It's a cyberpunk noir kind of thing. Like the whole point is that luck and the odds are rarely on the main character's side. Well, really, that applies to any fiction, right? Otherwise, the main character would have too easy a time. But I knew once the last scene was planned out, I didn't even have to write the thing, because it involves one of the antagonists who you presume is dead, sitting on a concrete block with his 2 bodyguards, and he's looking a bit worse for wear, but he's alive. And then he's looking at all the chaos around him, and all he's seeing is opportunity. And he just stands up, dusts his hands off, and goes, right, let's get to work. Yeah. And the implication is there's more to that.
Yeah.
What about you, Harry?
In what respect?
Series.
When
what
did you
point did you know it was going to be a series?
I'd forgotten what the original question was. I was so engrossed in what you were saying.
Excellent.
I think early on in book 1, I think, I don't know about you guys, but when you first have this idea that you're going to be a writer, you're going to be successful, and it's all going to be this massive sort of storm of adoration from your readers that are all going to, and they're going to need and clamour for more from you because your writing is so brilliant.
I remember those days.
Yeah. And so on that respect, you have this idea, well, I've got to write more than one book. And so early on, once you start writing, you start thinking, what else can I write? That was for me. I don't know about you, but you sort of go, oh, okay, I'm going to have to write more than one book. And if I'm going to get this publisher who's going to be sort of my lapdog and I can start throwing them more books, they're going to be interested if I can say, well, I've got 4 more planned and stuff like that. So you sort of idly come up with ideas for new books. And I think that is that's an important aspect for any writer, is that you don't want to have a situation where you finish one book and you have no idea what you're going to write next. I constantly write in a separate file ideas for books, and I just keep coming up with ideas for books and listing them. And so I have this sort of trove of simple ideas, and as a pantser writer, that could just me. I could just mean I just start writing that one because I like the idea of that, and it may be a short story, or it may develop further. And I've literally just finished a short story for a competition, and the character that was just a pantser written from an idea. I got to the end of the story and then went, you know what, that character could actually create a series from. I could actually move on and develop that into a full novel and then a novel series, because it's a detective. And so that can just sort of like fall into play. And I think if you start off writing and say, I've got one book in me and I don't want to write any more, that's going to be a rarity. Most writers think that they're going to write more than one.
And you get the bug, you get the writing bug.
Yeah.
I think if you can find that sweet spot where you know you've exhausted your storyline, if you get to book 4 or 5 and you think, you know what, I think I'm getting tired with this character, or maybe my readers are, maybe that's an opportunity to end the series on a, you know, something quite significant happens, which is letting your readers know, okay, the series has come to an end, and then you can start embarking. I think it's refreshing to embark on brand new projects and ideas.
Yeah.
I think ultimately for writers out there thinking about, you know, am I going to write a series? I think just think about what is your story about and what's the genre. I think the crime detective, you know, series, that genre lends itself to writing series.
Yeah.
Whereas when I wrote my standalone book, The Ghost Train and the Scarlet Moon, I like the idea of maintaining its integrity as a standalone, because that's the way the book works.
Yeah.
It's a historical mystery of the twisted time travel. It's one of those things, what could happen if you go back and change your past? And the book ends at the beginning, but the characters are sent off in a different direction, and it leaves the readers thinking about, what if?
Yeah.
And I like the idea of leaving the readers thinking about the consequences of how the book ends. And I've often thought about, you know, there might be scope for a second book, but I liked the idea of maintaining its integrity as a standalone. I think it's more powerful as a standalone, and there's a risk of ruining it, or, you know, sometimes less is more.
Well, I did want to ask about that, because with Ghost Train and Scarlet Moon, there is the potential for a second book, but not with the same characters, because you've already established that in this universe, time travel phenomena exists, and it exists as almost a force of nature, like a storm or something like that. It can't be controlled or harnessed. It just happens, and people have to adapt to it. So would you do like because Stephen King did a whole bunch of his books are interconnected. They're in universe, but they're all in from different characters' perspectives. So would you consider doing Ghost Train and Scarlet Moon 2, but a different place, different characters, but still with that same time travel phenomena?
Yeah, I have thought about that. I've even thought about doing so. I mean, the notion of the story is that the energy from this train crash coincides with this rare blood moon, and the two events happen at the same time. That creates this time slip. I've thought of using the same concept, but different circumstances. I had this idea of there was a ship had sunk. And it was a tragedy, a disaster, and there's an actual factual event in Brisbane where a ship had sunk in the Brisbane River that no one knows about, similar to the train crash story. And then I thought I could use the same idea with this same rare super blue blood moon, but it coincides with a different event, and have the same idea, but a completely brand new story. I have thought about that, but at the moment I'm focusing my energies on my crime series. So when I wrote book 1, I felt I really fell in love with my character, and I just felt that Jared O'Connor had more stories to tell, and that's what urged me to continue with that. I've finished book 3; they're being released later this year. I'm toying with the idea of a book 4. I do like the idea of a book 4 because I feel that there's still, at the moment, it's got enough legs to carry at least until a book 4. The one I'm writing at the moment is actually a spin-off book which has the potential to segue into my series. So I'm actually writing about a female detective who might ultimately end up partnering up with Jared O'Connor, but I want to tell her story first as a separate book. Yeah. So I'm playing with that idea as well. So I think, you know, it's almost like the Star Wars universe and all the spin-off movies that are happening. I'm having a play with that. So
with my series, I mean, as I say, I don't want to get into that sort of how can all of this happen to the same person aspect. And so I've limited it. I've reduced it from the original 5 books down to 4. But then again, you've got to remember he's featured in 32 short stories, so that's a lot for one character to keep going with. And as novels, I think I do have to actually draw the line and say, no, that's enough. I've now got to move on, and that also is freeing me up to write other things. And as I've mentioned before, I do want to start moving into more science fiction and stuff. And so at the moment, the paramedic sort of aspects and using that as the main character. I'm almost finished book 3, and I've got ideas that I'm just throwing down as I come along for book 4, and how that's going to go. That's probably going to get me in a bit of trouble because of some of the things that I'm going to say or my character might do. But that's we'll get there. And
it's future Harry's problem.
That's future Harry's problem. But
how very pantser of you.
But yeah, the thing is that I've also got ideas of the main detective Giallo G, using him for a story. I've got an idea for that, and so yeah, you do have these sort of spin-offs that you can think of that can then sort of run on their own and get their own legs.
Yeah,
and you've got an ex-police detective to help you make the story.
I turn up to some of his workshops.
Yeah. And you do see with those series where maybe the series continues, but through another character, someone who might have been a secondary character, suddenly as the writer, you think, oh, my readers seem to like this character, and I love this character. I've created this character who was initially a secondary character. They've got their own stories to tell, so you can, again, segue off and continue.
Yeah. I did have a question. This will be the last one, I reckon, because we've reached the 30-minute mark, but I wanted to ask you, do you guys know at what point your series will end?
As I've mentioned, I think
because you sound like you got a fairly
I've got it pretty much. Yeah, that's it.
Like you've got a clear event that will be the culminating thing. It's like after that, it's done.
As a paramedic.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and so that to carry on a story about a paramedic who's quit is I mean maybe many years in the future, whatever happens to Jono afterwards may be worth a story, but.
Oh, is he going to be in that sci-fi paramedic one?
Possibly. You never know.
That'd be pretty cool.
Jono goes back in time. Yeah.
Perhaps he's involved in this sort of event with a blood moon. I don't know.
We could merge our stories together.
Absolutely.
Like the ultimate crossover. Not since the Avengers has there been such an ambitious crossover. So you know when your series will end. Jack, do you have an idea about when we'll see the last of Jared
I don't.
O'Connor?
I guess it depends on, even though I'm writing, and that's why I'm writing this kind of it's a standalone that has the possibility of segueing into my series. So I'm kind of hedging my bets a little bit. I guess I'll see what the feedback is after book 3. So by the end of this year, 1, 2, and 3 will all be out, and I guess if I feel there's still room to push on the character's story and other things, will justify a new book, I will. I have a feeling, yes, I will move on to at least a book 4. But I also love the idea of doing something fresh. That's why I like the idea of, say, my standalone. It's a young adult. It's opened up opportunities to speak with high school students, whereas I can't talk to them about my crime series because they're very dark and it's pitched at an adult level. So it's really broadened my marketing opportunities by having a standalone in the young adult mystery time travel genre, and then I've got my dark, gritty adult crime series. 2 completely different markets, and it was very refreshing to write The Ghost Train because that was about me just being creative and not drawing on my policing experience and cheating. This was challenging myself. What can I really do, and how creative can I be in an area that's not reliant upon my policing experience?
And I think for writers out there who are listening, the idea of writing short stories may be the way to actually start coming up with ideas for other series. Because as your book has started from a short story, if you sort of write, you're far less invested in a standalone short story than you are invested in a standalone novel. It takes a lot less time to write a short story, and by writing numerous short stories, you can then say perhaps pick one and go, actually, that one's got legs. That one can move on, and I can write more on that one, and that one's going to make a novel.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, well, we might wrap up. So plenty of food for thought for our writers out there who are listening, and stay tuned in terms of our own books, and hopefully that's helped our listeners make some decisions around, are you going to write as standalones or invest in a series? So we'll pull up stumps for this episode. That's about all we have time for in our genre fiction podcast. Don't forget to share, like, and comment. And once again, we'd like to express our thanks to the Fellowship of Australian Writers Queensland for providing us with this awesome audio equipment. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
See you later.